all appreciated the little musical interlude. We have to thank Beth Gates, the reference librarian, who very kindly pointed Joanna in the direction of a website that had music from that era, little scratches and all. So, my name is Penny Wright. I think I know most of you, and I want to thank you all for being here. We are celebrating National Library Week, and we were looking down a long list of topics to see what might interest us and you for this week, and we were very pleased to be interested in a subject that we found a speaker for, and our speaker is with us tonight, and his name is Dr. Michael Barnhart. He is Distinguished Teaching Professor of History at Stony Brook University, where he has taught since receiving his doctorate from Harvard University in 1980. He has written over 24 scholarly articles and book chapters and numerous books, including 2 about Japan, one titled Japan Prepares for Total War, The Search for Economic Security from 1919 to 1941, which was, by the way, recently translated into Korean. And the other Japanese-related book, and there may be more, but I know another title, is Japan in the World Since 1968. Is that correct? 8? Oh, I'm sorry about that. His current project is a 2-volume survey entitled E Pluribus, A Political History of American Foreign Relations from Jamestown to Obama. So that's an ambitious task, and we're hoping that we will hear from him when he completes this. In the meantime, please welcome Dr. Michael Barnhart.
Thank you, Penny. I'd like to thank the staff of the Southampton Library for asking me to come this evening. I'd like to at least thank all of you for spending a very pleasant evening here about a subject that is not altogether pleasant, America's road into the First World War. I'd like to divide my talk into roughly 4 parts. The initial outbreak of the war in 1914 and why the United States was more likely to become involved in war with Britain at that point instead of Germany. How that changed just a year later with the sinking of Lusitania and why the United States did not enter the war in 1915. How the Lusitania resolution led to a separate Sussex crisis in 1816, where again the United States did not enter the war, and why finally the United States did in 1917. If there's a unifying theme to my talk, and of course there is, it is that history is not inevitable. It doesn't have to turn out the way that it in fact does. There are contingencies, there are turning points, there are milestones at every point in the way where things could have happened differently. So my chief task this evening is to show you some of those alternate paths, why things turned out the way they did, by showing you in some respects why they didn't turn out any different from the way they did. So first, to get to it, the outbreak of war, August 1914. Most Americans, frankly, could have cared less about the outbreak of war in Europe. They spent, if you take a look at the newspaper headlines, and if we could get a time machine and go back to Southampton in the summer of 1914, I suspect we would have very few people strolling up and down the beach talking about the outbreak of war in Europe. It was about as popular as what's going on in the Ukraine. Nowadays, I don't think many of you wake up this morning saying, gee, I wonder what happened in the Ukraine today, although there is a war going on there. Americans weren't paying very much attention to what was going on, and to the extent that they were, namely the policymakers in Washington, they were much more concerned about the prospects of American friction with Great Britain, that side of the World War disposition, not Germany. And they had good reason to be worried about Anglo-American relations at the outbreak of the war. Because if we could get in that same time machine and also go through space and go to London in the summer of 1914, we would discover what the American policymakers suspected, and that was that Britain's chief contribution to the Allies, its chief allies being France and Russia, against Germany and Austria-Hungary, Britain's chief contribution to the alliance was going to be through the Royal Navy. Britain was going to literally starve Germany and Austria-Hungary into submission by imposing a naval blockade around Europe. This was not new for the British. This is something they had done against France in the Napoleonic Wars about a century earlier. It was very easy to predict for both the Americans and the British to figure out that this was going on. But there were some things different about 1914 as compared to a century earlier in the Napoleonic Wars. And I'm going to introduce a technical term, but don't worry, I'll explain it right away. The difference in 1914 was the definition of contraband. Contraband, according to international law, is illegal cargo. A neutral nation, as a nation that's not involved in war, enjoys neutral rights. And among those neutral rights is the ability to sell its goods to both sides as it wishes, with its ships carrying its goods, neutral ships, neutral goods, being free from hindrance from any blockade, except in the category of contraband. In the case of the old Napoleonic Wars, what constituted contraband and what did not was quite clear. Contraband, its traditional definition, was an implement of war. So, if the United States had happened to be neutral, which it was during the Napoleonic Wars, it could sell whatever it pleased to either Napoleon's France or Wellington's Britain, except for implements of war. You could not, if you were an American merchant skipper, put muskets or gunpowder in your ship and expect them to escape the British blockade. That was illegal cargo, it was seizable cargo, it was contraband. Well, what had changed by 1914 that led the Americans to suspect there were going to be difficulties with Great Britain? Well, what had changed was the Industrial Revolution. What constituted an implement of war in 1914? It was by no means quite so clear because of industry. It was so easy to make things into implements of war that the British thought they were going to insist, and in fact did insist, that implements of war, the definition of contraband, ought to be expanded to include anything that could readily be made into an instrument of war, because Germany, after all, was an industrial power. Germany could make lots of implements of war from goods that the United States and other neutral nations might wish to sell to it, which would foil the whole purpose of the British blockade. Well, once you admit that wider definition of contraband, you get into all sorts of complications. That is, where do you stop? The British insisted, well, copper should be contraband, because copper can be made into brass. And brass is the key component of shell casings, right? Used in the making of bullets. So, copper ought to be included. Brass, of course, ought to be included. And gee, while we're at it, iron should be included, and iron ore should be included. And soldiers have to eat, so food ought to be included too in that. Well, this is friction, and it's friction between the United States and Great Britain. And Great Britain that wants to insist on the widest possible definition of contraband, and the United States, or actually American merchants and merchant shippers, that want to insist on the most narrow definition of contraband. And it leads to a real crisis between Washington and London by the autumn of 1914, because under the rules of blockade, if the British ships find an American merchant ship that is carrying contraband, it is legally able to seize that cargo without compensation. So, friction, crisis. What happens when the British Navy starts seizing American ships carrying cotton, copper, brass, whatever, to Germany? Well, for a time, this crisis was averted, and was averted by the very fact that Britain back then was the superpower of its day. And part of that superpower status was it was a wealthy power. So what the British agreed to do was, we will defer this debate over contraband. You can have your definition, we'll have ours. But in these gray areas where things like brass, copper, and cotton, where our ships do intercept an American ship bound for Germany selling these kinds of goods, We will confiscate those goods. We're not going to let them go through to Germany so that the Germans can make them into weapons. But we will compensate. The American owners will pay for the cargoes. We won't seize them outright. We'll pay market value for those cargoes. Crisis averted. But it's a crisis averted in 1914 that is averted only because the British, along with virtually every other European power that went to war in August, figured that the war was going to be short. It was an industrial war, right, with mass armies, modern firepower, artillery, and so forth. No one could conceive of this kind of war being prolonged. In fact, if you read the European newspapers, on both sides, they're predicting that this war will be over, done, victorious by Christmas 1914. And that is exactly the calculation that the British used in saying, well, we're not going to have any problems just buying off the Americans, right, for the few months that this conflict goes on. But of course, it didn't go on for just a few months. The Christmas of 1914 arrived, and there were trenches built from Switzerland to the English Channel, with nobody making much progress on either side. The prospect of a long, in fact, prolonged war was a very real one going into its second year of 1915. And by all rights, 1915 should have produced a real crisis between the United States and Great Britain, because at some point Britain was going to, wars were expensive, run out of money and become unable to pay for the American cargoes that British ships were still seizing by 1915. But as our story turns to 1915, and the obvious question is raised, well, why wasn't there a crisis between the United States and Great Britain? There wasn't, because there was a separate crisis that occurred in May of 1915 when a German submarine, a German U-boat, sank the Lusitania. The sinking of the Lusitania was the result of Germany's retaliation for the British naval blockade of Germany. Germany didn't have a surface fleet that could contest with the Royal Navy on the surface of the ocean, and so couldn't counter the British blockade directly. But there was, it's 1914, not 1814 any longer, there's this new weapon, a submarine, that can coast silently under the British warships, break past Great Britain, in fact, and commence what Germany declares as a submarine blockade of Great Britain. But of course, there are crucial differences in a submarine blockade. A submarine depends on stealth. It's a relatively fragile ship, certainly the submarines of 1914 and 15 were. They have to stay submerged, they have to fire torpedoes. In other words, shoot first, ask questions later. It's not in the case of a British ship that can intercept an American cargo ship, say, hey, let us see your cargo, determine if there's contraband there, and if there is, escort that ship into London or some other Liverpool or some other British harbor. No, a German U-boat, the only way it can have an effective, the only way a submarine blockade can be effective is to sink the ships on the high seas and all hands go down. So the submarine blockade is fundamentally a different animal, and to be sure, some German policymakers in 1915, when Germany declared its submarine blockade, said, we're not so sure that this is a good idea, because it's going to lead to loss of civilian lives. And I know with Syria and all this other stuff, we've become quite used to the loss of civilian life, but in 1915, that was somehow barbaric. If you put on a uniform, that was basically saying, the other guy has a right to murder you. Right? You're wearing a uniform, you're combatant. But if you're not, some of us, there were reservations raised in Berlin. Should we really go ahead with this submarine blockade? Because innocent merchant sailors are going to be killed, and who knows what collateral damage there might be. But the German Navy insisted that the submarine blockade take forth, and they had a really good argument for maintaining that although a submarine blockade might in fact lead to civilian casualties, it was nevertheless morally justified. They didn't just say militarily justified. It was morally justified to undertake against Great Britain. And the reason they pointed to, although they didn't use quite the same numbers that I'm going to give to you in just a moment, was the impact of the British blockade on the German civilian population. Because, of course, the British blockade, by shutting off this wide definition of contraband, cotton, food, that directly affected the German civilian population. So that the numbers not only going to give you are from the end of 1915 rather than the exact time when Germany decides to commence its submarine blockade, but they're roughly comparable. Here is an average diet for a German adult by the end of 1915. I always challenge my students at Stony Brook to see if they can adhere to this diet. 1 egg per week, 7 ounces of bread a day, 1 potato a day. Stop. That's it. So, the German Navy is saying, this is a starvation diet. And it's not affecting just our soldiers. It's affecting our civilians. It's affecting our children. So, yeah, we're not just militarily justified in declaring the submarine blockade. We are morally justified in declaring the submarine blockade, and declare it they do. And the submarine blockade gets underway in 1915, and the German Navy is just singing its praises, saying, submarine, this new miracle weapon, this new modern weapon, we will sink all the merchant shipping bound for Great Britain, an island nation itself dependent on foreign trade. We'll have the British begging for peace within a year. It doesn't quite work out that way. And it doesn't work out that way because of exactly the collateral damage that occurred in the most famous ship, first torpedo, the most famous civilian losses, the Lusitania. That's not what the German U-boat captain thought he was firing that torpedo at on that fateful day in May of 1915. Like all submarine skippers of the era, and for all I know, submarine skippers right down to the present day, and probably not, now that I think about it, they have a book that lists ship silhouettes, so that when you run your periscope up and take a look at the ships up there, you can recognize what kind of ship you're looking at. And that fateful day, the German commander put his periscope up, and he saw a very distinctive ship in the sights of the periscope. It was clearly a large ship, and it had 4 stacks. He got his book out and looked through it and said, aha, this has got to be the British ship Mauretania. The Mauretania had been converted to be a troop transport, carrying thousands of British troops into battle. And the German U-boat commander said, I have struck it rich. This is the perfect target for me. The only thing that puzzled him was that the Mauretania was, if you know you're in a submarine blockade zone and there are wolves in the water out there, and the only way that they can get at you is to fire a torpedo, which they didn't have homing torpedoes back then. You fire a torpedo, it runs ballistic, right? It runs in a straight line. Right? So if you're a ship in a blockade zone, you zigzag. Right? You just change your course at random to, so that in case somebody fires a torpedo at you, it's going to miss, because you changed your course from the time it was launched. The only thing that the U-boat commander couldn't figure out was the Mauretania was not zigzagging, which was awfully weird for a troop ship. Fired the torpedo, hot, straight, and normal, couldn't miss. The ship wasn't zigzagging. Struck right at the waterline, and the U-boat commander had a second surprise. A huge explosion, a lot bigger than just a torpedo going off, a lot bigger. The ship sank very rapidly, and the U-boat commander, like the U-boat commander, made a note in his log, said, fired at British troop ship Mauretania, sank a lot quicker than I thought it was going to in return. By the time he got back, there was a major international crisis between the United States and Germany. Why the United States and Germany? The Lusitania was a British ship. It was flying a British flag. So by the submarine blockade rules, it was fair game for the Germans to fire on. And indeed, after the submarine skipper came back and reported this huge secondary explosion, it was confirmed, and it was confirmed, and the British didn't deny it, that the Lusitania had been carrying rifle ammunition in its cargo hold, which unluckily for the passengers is exactly where the torpedo had struck, and you get a big secondary explosion. The Lusitania goes down a lot quicker than that. Lusitania, sister ship to the Mauretania, right, same silhouette. Well, ordinarily that wouldn't have been a crisis between the United States and Germany, except for the fact that 1,200 civilians went down with Lusitania. And of those 1,200, about 120 were Americans. Now, even that, there wasn't necessarily a crisis between the United States and Germany over the Lusitania. What was not in the newspapers at the time, but we now know because we have access to the archives, was that the sinking of Lusitania sparked a fierce debate inside Washington itself. Inside, in fact, the White House and State Department over what the proper American response ought to be to the loss of American lives in the Lusitania sinking. And I don't want to throw a lot of names at you, but there are two names that are pretty important in this debate. One is the Secretary of State himself, William Jennings Bryan, major figure in the Democratic Party, had run for president himself on several occasions prior to that. Bryan was from Nebraska, and that made a difference. Because Bryan pointed to the 120-odd Americans who had lost their lives and said, let's take a look at the names on that passenger list. And the one that he pointed to first was called Vanderbilt, as in the Vanderbilts, who rather, by the way, just a piece of trivia, had quite gallantly given his life jacket to a woman on the Lusitania, even though he couldn't swim. Back in those days, there were no regulations about life jackets, so the wealthy, of course, they had their own, but nobody else did. Anyway, Vanderbilt died. He was one of the names on the list. And Bryan said, look, it's the rich people. It was the rich guys that went down with the Lusitania. And Bryan pointed out quite accurately that when those rich guys had gotten on the Lusitania in New York, there were warning signs posted saying, this ship is entering a submarine blockade zone at your own risk. You sail on this at your own risk. And Bryan said, okay, what are we going to do now? Are we going to provoke a first-class diplomatic crisis with Germany and possibly go to war with Germany so that the Vanderbilts of the United States can enjoy luxury rides across the Atlantic? Who's going to die in that war? Bryan said, it's the farmer boys of Nebraska, that's it. Should we ask the farmer boys of Nebraska to give their lives so that the Vanderbilts of New York, that's exactly how he put it, can sail unimpeded between New York and Great Britain? Bryan said, no. These guys had a warning. They traveled at their own risk. I'm sorry, even the Vanderbilt died, although he really wasn't. Bryan really hated New York bankers. But the fact of the matter is, this is not worth a war between the United States and Germany. That's Bryan's case. Shouldn't be a Lusitania crisis at all with Germany. But Bryan's own number two man in the State Department was a fellow called Robert Lansing, who would go on to replace Bryan a few years later. Lansing was a New York City lawyer. He had worked for the big companies like Vanderbilt's all his life, and he had a very strong view of American neutral rights. He said, neutral rights include not just neutral ships being able to go where they please, and the Lusitania was not a neutral ship. And neutral rights includes not just American goods going where they please. Neutral rights should include American citizens going where they please, even if they go there on belligerent ships, even if they go there on ships flying the flag of the nation at war through a submarine blockade zone. The same neutral rights should still apply. And Lansing had a pretty good argument himself. He said, look, if we give up American neutral rights for Vanderbilt, we give them up for every other American citizen, yet even those Nebraska farmers. So we shouldn't back down. We should have a crisis with Germany. We should force Germany to recognize the right, the neutral right of Americans to travel the high seas any way they please. Well, it was up to Woodrow Wilson to decide between these two contending points of view, and he decided with Lansing. And he sent an ultimatum to Germany that basically said, if you're going to apologize for the sinking of Lusitania, you're going to pay reparations to the families of the Americans for that, but most importantly, you're going to promise never to do this again, which means you will never attack another passenger ship again, no matter what flag it's flying, no matter what cargo it might have in its hold. That was the Lusitania crisis, and it shocked the German Navy, but it didn't shock the German Chancellor, the guy who had predicted problems with the submarine blockade in the first place. The German Navy went to the German Kaiser, Wilhelm II, who had the ultimate say in this, and the Navy said, don't you dare call off the submarine blockade. We need the submarine blockade to starve Britain like they're starving our children. The German Chancellor went to the Kaiser and said, if you don't give up the submarine blockade, as Wilson is demanding, we're going to be at war with the United States. And that means eventually we will lose this war because the Americans will come in on the side of our enemies. Wilhelm was not a decisive man, although he liked to appear that way, and he turned to the third major actor in Germany, the Chancellor, who had said lift the submarine blockade, the German Navy that said you must keep the submarine blockade, but the most important actor of them all, especially in 1915, was the German Army. The German Army in 1915 said, look, we're not real worried about the United States. The United States, unlike all the other major powers of the world, did not maintain a large peacetime army. Every European power, and Japan too for that matter, had pretty much universal manhood conscription, right? If you were male, you served a period of time in your army, and you went, when you mustered out of the regulars, you went into the reserves so that you could be called back and be post-war. When the First World War broke out, the United States didn't have anything like that. It had an all-volunteer army, a tiny army. And the German army in these debates, this crucial debate in the Lusitania crisis, simply said, look, we know for a fact it will take the Americans a year and a half at best, and probably more like 2 years to field a mass army, to raise and get a mass army over here in Europe. And we think the war will be over by then. So we're not worried about the American army. Now you might think, oh, this is bad news because the German army is going to say keep the submarine blockade, and if they had said that, the United States might well have entered the war in 1915 instead of 2 years later, as it did. But the German army said no, the submarine blockade must be lifted, and it must be lifted not because they were worried about the American army, but because they were worried about all the other European neutrals, Holland, Denmark, Romania, by themselves midgets. But at the crucial point where the war seemed to be in the balance, 1915, the German army said these European neutrals might tip it against us. We can't afford to alienate other neutrals who might come into the war if the United States, the biggest neutral, comes in, so lift the submarine blockade. German Navy protested, said, well, what about the German children starving as a result of the British blockade? And the Kaiser announced a compromise, but a compromise that gave Wilson virtually everything that he wanted. The compromise that the Kaiser agreed to was that Germany would keep the submarine blockade, but the submarine blockade would not apply to any passenger ship. So there'd be no more Lusitanias. And Lansing would get what he wanted. American citizens could go where they pleased without worrying about another torpedo, as it happened to the Lusitania. Problem solved. Or was it? The problem that remained after the Navy, the German Navy, got its new orders, not at all happy about them, by the way, was how do you be sure what's a passenger ship and what isn't? It's not so obvious. And for a German submarine to surface and wave at the British ship and say, hey, are you a passenger ship, or are you a cargo ship, or are you a warship? Well, that's not a very healthy thing to do for your submarine. So there were situations of ambiguity, and sooner or later, one of these ambiguous situations was going to come back to haunt American-German relations. And that's exactly what happened in 1916 over the Sussex crisis, which, alas, Sussex is kind of the Rodney Dangerfield of the First World War. Nobody's ever heard of it, even though it's every bit as pivotal and instrumental in the United States eventually entering the war. The Sussex was a French, not British, it was a French Channel steamer. Before the channel was built, back in the old days, you had to actually travel by water to get between France and Britain. And Sussex was one of the ferries, kind of like Orient Point or, out of Port Jeff here. And really the Sussex didn't look all that different. It was a little bit bigger, and it didn't carry automobiles. But it was a channel steamer. And difficult to tell whether it's a passenger ship or not. And the Sussex was attacked in the summer of 1916 by a German submarine. About 90 people lost their lives. At first, people thought there were Americans among them, hence the crisis, a new crisis between Germany and the United States. It turned out that no Americans did lose their lives in the Sussex things, although as an historian I cannot resist taking just a few minutes to tell you a very sad story. No Americans lost their lives when the Sussex went down, but there was one very young American history graduate student, Sam Bemis was his name, who was writing a book on America during the Napoleonic Wars. He had just completed a year-and-a-half research in the French archives at Paris, and he was on his way to London to take a look at the British archives. And while Bemis did not lose his life in the Sussex attack, the trunk with all of his research notes went down. A year and a half of work, so he wondered somehow, maybe I should have gone down with the trunk and saved myself, returning to Paris and reading through everything again and taking all the same notes and so forth. Well, be that as it may, Bemis made it back alive. No Americans did lose their lives in Sussex, but it was a violation of the Lusitania promise. A passenger ship had been attacked. And it was clear that, as the German U-boat commanders themselves admitted, as British Navy admitted, as the American State Department admitted, as a practical matter, it's impossible to ask the German submarine skippers to know, for sure what a passenger, what is a passenger ship and what is not a passenger ship. So if things stay as they are, there will inevitably be more Sussex-style incidents in the future, and inevitably some of those will involve American citizens losing their lives, and we'll be right back to where we were at the time of the Lusitania crisis. So, same departments are aired in the Department of State, although Bryan, who resigned after Lusitania because he felt very strongly it was not worth a war, there were still arguments saying, is the Sussex worth a war with Germany? This is pretty serious business, especially if the Germans don't back down. But this time, in the case of the Sussex debates, what the Americans argued was, look, we sent a very stern note to Germany in 1915 for the Lusitania, and what did they do? They backed down. So let's send a stern note this time in the case of the attack on the Sussex. And we'll be willing to bet that it does not lead to war, that Germany will back down once again. Wilson, once again, was persuaded by that argument and sent an even stronger note to Germany, this time saying, look, given the fact that we can't tell easily, your U-boat commanders can't tell easily between what is a passenger ship and what is not, I am going to demand that you call off the blockade entirely. All or nothing. Well, that was a much stronger note than Wilson had given during the Lusitania crisis, and it prompted a much fiercer debate back in Berlin. And once again, the chief protagonists in that debate were the German chancellor, who once again argued, we can't afford to have the Americans in, we have to stop the submarine blockade. The German Navy that said, now more than ever, we need the submarine blockade, because if you say not just we have to leave passenger ships alone, but we have to leave all ships alone, there is no submarine blockade. And sooner or later the British blockade will starve us into submission, and we will lose the war, so we must keep the submarine blockade. And once again, the deciding vote in the Sussex crisis in 1916 went to the German army. The German army in 1916 was not worried about the other European neutrals because a fair number of them had already entered the war between 1815 and 1916. And one might think that on that account, the German army in 1916, the Sussex crisis, might have voted with the Navy, keep the submarine blockade in place. And once again, he would have been wrong, because the German army, in fact, did argue we have to give the Americans what they want. We have to avoid American intervention in the war. But they did so for not a negative reason, that they were scared of American entry. They still thought it would take 2 years or so for the United States to get ready. But because they thought, why let the Navy win this war when we in the Army can win it in 1916? And the Kaiser was puzzled. He said, well, what do you mean? You weren't able to break the trenches in 1914. You weren't able to break them in 1915. Why do you think the German Army can win the war in 1916? And the Germans said, because we have a new plan. And it was a new plan that was instrumental in eventually leading to American intervention in the First World War. And it's probably a plan that most of you, if you watch the History Channel or read history books about this period, know about. The plan centered around the French city of Verdun. Verdun was a fortress city in the literal sense of that word. It occupied a key position at the French border near Germany, so key that the German army was absolutely convinced that under no circumstances would France ever abandon Verdun, that France would fight to the last man to defend Verdun. And that is exactly what Germany meant for them to do, to fight to the last Frenchman. The German army argued, look, for every French soldier, there are 1.5 German soldiers. We're just a bigger country than France. So, the brutal logic of the First World War, all we have to do is kill 1 French soldier for each German soldier that we lose, and France is going to run out of men. Simplicity itself. So confident was the German army about its plans for the attack on Verdun that it voted to lift the submarine blockade. We will win the war on land at Verdun in 1916. And Verdun, if you've ever watched any of the History Channel documentaries about it or read anything about it, it was a horror show. Included the first use of phosgene gas, flamethrowers, all of the things that make us civilized these days. Savage combat. But the calculus, the German calculus, was wrong. It wasn't just 1 for 1. Both sides fled each other white by the end of 1916. Verdun had failed. It had driven both sides, in fact, into exhaustion. The Germans didn't know it, another trivia point, but they had induced a French mutiny in the French army. By the end of 1916, French soldiers were saying to their own officers, we're not going to engage in any more attacks across no man's land. We've had enough. And the French actually had to make concessions to the soldiers. It was a mutiny that led to the collapse of French offensive actions from 1916 till the Americans got involved in the war. So the Germans came close with the bloodletting of Verdun, but not close enough. France still stood, and the German army itself was exhausted, and that brings us to 1917. The key decisions I'm arguing this evening that led to American intervention in the First World War were made in Berlin. More particularly, they were made by the German army as a result of the failure of the Verdun offensive, because it was no secret. By Christmas time 1916, it was obvious Verdun had not succeeded. France was still in the war, and now the German Navy went to the Kaiser and said, "We told you so." The German army assured you that Verdun was going to win the war, and we gave up the submarine blockade on the word of the German army, and the word of the German army is false. They did not succeed in beating France into submission. So now it's time, now that our civilians, our women and children are suffering worse than ever, to unleash the submarines, no matter what the consequences. It's time to make Britain feel what we felt. It's time to drive Britain from the war with a submarine blockade. And I'll tell you one other story, just to illustrate the depths to which the German civilian population had been plunged by the effectiveness of the British blockade, now moving our clock up to 1917. And the story is set in Berlin back in, I don't know if any of you visited Berlin or not, and see some of the old trolley lines there. During the war, the Great War, you couldn't spare electricity to run the trolleys in Berlin, and you couldn't spare even in charcoal or coal to fuel engines to pull the trolleys, so they went back to horses. The horses pulled the trolley cars in Berlin. Oh, okay, that's all right, but there wasn't much feed for the horses either. Not in a Germany under that kind of blockade. So the horses tend to literally die of starvation and exhaustion. And they would die in the harness. And the story, I'll never forget, just reading some of the memoirs from Berlin these years, was the horse was pulling a trolley and just collapsed. Died. Fell down in the streets of Berlin. And the housewives from all the houses around rushed out with their kitchen knives to get just a little slice of meat for themselves and their families. And it's that kind of environment in which the German Navy goes to the Kaiser and says, it's time to give the British back. Get them back for what they've been doing to us. The German Chancellor says, no, this is going to bring the Americans in. Haven't we learned anything from the Lusitania and the Sussex? And once again, the deciding vote is up to the German army. But this time with a difference. With the failure of Verdun came a wide, sweeping change in German high command. The author of the Verdun Plan obviously was disgraced. It had failed. He was forced from office. And his replacements, you might have heard of these guys, von Hindenburg and von Ludendorff, were dedicated disciples of the total war doctrine. And total war means just what it says. You use all the tools at your disposal. So the German army in this third debate, not over the Lusitania in 1915, not over the Sussex in 1916, but over the failure of Verdun by the start of 1917, the German army says, we change our vote. We think it's imperative to begin a submarine blockade at once. And in fact, we think the submarine blockade should be total. We should sink not just British ships, not just British passenger ships. We should sink American ships too. Anything that's bound for Great Britain, that's fair game. In this environment, the Kaiser said, yes, I agree completely, and he declares unrestricted submarine warfare around Great Britain. That's not quite the end of the story. News of sinking of American ships. So far, the first ones were American merchant ships, not passenger ships. But still, American ships. Wilson wanted to know, were they flying the American flag? Yes, they were. Could it have been an isolated incident? Well, after he has 3 or 4 or 5 or a dozen reports of sinkings, it's pretty clear it's not an isolated incident. It's pretty clear that the German submarine captains have orders to attack American ships, even when it's clear that they are American. So, Wilson says, all right, it's not a problem. I sent Germany a stiff note over Lusitania in 1915 and they backed down. I sent Germany a stiff note over the Sussex in 1916 and they backed down. I'm going to send them a stiff note again in 1917 and they'll back down. Except, of course, they didn't, because what Wilson did not know was the internal dynamics inside Berlin, that the German army had changed its vote and there was no going back after that. Once it was clear that this time, unlike the other 2 times, Germany was not going to back down. And Wilson got word that even though he had sent his note threatening to break relations, that German submarines were still sinking American ships. Wilson felt he had no option to not only break relations, but to ask Congress for a declaration of war. That's exactly what he did. And in that kind of environment, with clear evidence that multiple American ships were being sunk, the American Congress, which back in those quaint days actually did declare war and gave the president authorization to use force. I know this seems like 2 centuries ago, because it was. Right? Congress decided by an overwhelming vote to authorize the use of war. Only one member of Congress prominently opposed the declaration of war. That was Jeanette Rankin of Montana, who would go on to have the distinction of being the only person to vote against American entry in the Second World War, a generation later. But she was a lone soul in both 1917, well, not completely alone in 1917. Charles Lindbergh's father also voted against going to war in 1917, but she was part of a small minority that voted against the war in 1917, and the only one in 1941. But that is the story of how the United States got involved in the First World War. Thank you very much.
Would you take some questions?
I'll be happy to take questions.
How many ships were sunk by U-boats?
I don't know.
The submarines. Okay,
I
that's
don't
not
know.
really
The quick answer is I don't know.
hundreds, maybe hundreds of different
Well, if you
British,
take,
French.
yes, absolutely. If you take the entire duration of the First World War, and if you include American, British, and French ships, it certainly ran into the hundreds, because in a way the German Navy was right that the submarine blockade could be devastatingly effective, because in 1917 and 18, well, the whole First World War, there was no sonar. There's no easy way to locate a submarine, when it's submerged. In fact, the only way they had was what they called a hydrophone, which actually is kind of an accurate name for it. You literally drop a pair of microphones over your ship into the water and listen for the U-boat. But of course, that has a catch. Your own ship has to be completely stationary, right? Because otherwise you hear the sounds of your own propeller. And of course, if your own ship is stationary, and there really is a U-boat in the vicinity, the first sound you hear is likely to be a torpedo aimed right for your ship. So, the Navy was right. The submarine blockade could have been effective. And, one of the great ironies is, what if Germany would have tried it in 1915 instead of backing down? And it's one of those great what-ifs of history. We'll never know. Yes.
Was there any discussion in Germany about using the submarines against British warships that were blockading Germany? Because sinking ships headed to Britain isn't going to defeat German citizens unless Germany is defeated.
Yes, that's a good question, and it has for once, history usually doesn't give you straightforward answers, but this time it does. The reason the Germans decided to commence a submarine blockade in the first place is because of the initial successes all the way back in 1914 that German submarines had against British warships. And they had those successes precisely because the submarine was a brand new weapon. Right? British warships would be, in fact, there's a famous case in the autumn of 1914. There were 3 British cruisers that were in the North Sea that were anchored. They were anchored because, if you see a German surface ship, you have plenty of time to raise steam, get underway, and engage the surface ship. They're not even thinking about submarines, right? In the surface ships of the British Royal Navy. Well, one of the very first German U-boats happens upon these 3 cruisers and says, "Oh, looky here." It's a perfect, they're not, forget zigzagging. They're just sitting there, ducks. Sinks all 3. Comes back to Germany and says, "The U-boat is the miracle weapon. Right? My one little U-boat just sank 3 British cruisers, single-handed. Just think what we can do for a blockade." And indeed, if you take a look at the German Navy planning, their initial blockade is a counterforce blockade. Right? Let's go after the British warships. Alas, the technology of 1914, 1915 simply isn't up to the task. Once the British surface warships figure out, oh gee, we can't just sit in the water, they maintain steady cruising speed, which is far faster than anything a U-boat can maintain on the surface or submerged. So, it would be tremendous luck for a U-boat to be able to successfully attack a British warship after that initial success. The only exception would be the ports, the actual naval bases, and the British learned very early on to create submarine patrols, and really effective were submarine nets. They would just, would go below the water and prevent the U-boats from coming in. So the technology of the First World War simply wasn't sufficient to allow a successful campaign against the warships. They were simply too fast. The merchant ships, though, they were plenty slow. If you missed the initial ambush, you could probably maneuver for a second shot at those.
You mentioned that twice at least the Germans said, well, no problem about the American army because it's going to take them a couple of years to get going anyway. And yet that battle in France, they lost, I'm thinking, because of the contradiction of the Americans. How did the Americans get their army together that way, or did they not?
Yeah, the answer is they did not. Not quick enough. The intercession of the American army by the summer and autumn of 1918 will be sufficient to allow the Allies to commence offensive operations. But, and this is a really big but, something that happened in the meantime, something rather important, and that was virtually the same time that Wilson's bringing the United States into the war, Russia's dropping out. It's the beginning of what will eventually become the October Revolution, the rise of the Bolsheviks and communists in what will become the Soviet Union. And what that means is that all the German troops on the Russian front can be literally railroaded to attack France, and they're shipping them in. It's almost kind of a race during the winter of 1917-1918. Because it's clear that the Germans are going to mount a major attack against France in the spring of 1918. And they do, and it comes within a hair's breadth of succeeding. If we could get our time machine and go back to the Eiffel Tower in spring of 1918, Eiffel Tower, you couldn't see the German lines from the Eiffel Tower then, but you could hear the German artillery from downtown Paris. That's how close they got as that attack. Well, Britain and France both saw that coming, and so did the Americans, and there was a fierce debate between the European allies and the Americans. The Europeans saying, we need American troops here a lot faster than you can raise an American army to get them here. So what they wanted to do was, look, you draft the American boys and send them into the British and French armies, right? And they argued that this not only would save a lot of time in getting them across, but the British and French said, it'll save a lot of American lives too, because they'll be serving under British and French officers that are seasoned, that understand how the war operates rather than having to reinvent the wheel like American officers will. And you might say, well, gee, that sounds like it makes an awful lot of sense to send the Americans over kind of, one by one and merge them into British and French units, except the American Army, General Pershing and all that said, no way are we going to do that. They're going to fight under the Stars and Stripes. They're going to fight in all-American units. And if that means a delay, well, that means a delay. And it wasn't just Pershing alone. The State Department, too, was saying, if we don't have an independent American army on the ground that's responsible for winning the war, we don't have a say at the peace table in determining what Europe and the world will look like after the war. So the Americans pushed back and said, yeah, we know you're desperate. Yeah, we know the German hammer is going to fall in the spring of 1918, but, they're going to fight under their own flag. And they reached a compromise. And the compromise was that Americans would raise up to battalion-sized units and send them over, and they would be amalgamated in with British and French regiments and divisions and corps and so forth. So they did reach a compromise, which was just enough to win. So that's a very good question. Mm-hmm.
The Lusitania. I had read somewhere that the part of the problem with that explosion was that the coal dust in the coal butt, because it was a double-hulled ship, and the coal bunkers were in the outside between the two hulls, and that the coal dust had a lot to do with that massive explosion. But you said earlier that it was the munitions.
Yeah, it's certainly possible that the coal dust was a major contributing factor, or no factor. We don't know, and the forensic evidence is not going to be decisive. It wasn't at the time, and it's not going to be now. What we do know is that the Lusitania was carrying that ammunition, and whether that was a factor or not, it was great ammunition for the Germans to use in saying, hey, you know, this was a fair game attack.
Why were the British and the Germans warring with each other?
Do you have a semester? Okay, I'll give you the really condensed version. The Austro-Hungarian Archduke and heir to the throne had been assassinated by a Serbian nationalist, who the Austrians instantly called a terrorist, in the summer of 1914. That provoked an Austrian ultimatum to Serbia that was basically to lead to Austria's annexation of Serbia if Serbia had agreed to it. That would have made no difference to anybody except for the fact that Austria-Hungary was allied with Germany, and that alliance had obligations. That is, the Austrians could go to the Germans and say, if we get into a war with another major power, you have to back us up. And the Serbians immediately went to the Russians. And the Russians said, if Austria attacks you, we will back you up. Austrians now go to the Germans and say, okay, we're invoking the clause of our alliance. You have to back us up. The Russians now go to the French, who had an alliance with Russia, and said, we are invoking the alliance clause. You must back us up. So, domino, Serbia, Austria, Germany, Russia, France, and Britain, which was allied with France. And that's how the two sides, that's the real Cliff Notes version. There's some interesting stuff in the German Army planning documents, but I will skip that in the interest of reading. Here, it's the alliance system that's key. Yes?
I just wanted to know about how many U-boats did Germany have?
Yeah, that, I don't have my finger on the precise number, but I can tell you that at the time of those initial sinkings against the British warships, Germany could maintain about a half dozen U-boats at sea at any given time. That's it, right? And unlike the Second World War, where Germany really is able to maintain large numbers of submarines in the Atlantic, a very different operation. In the First World War, they are never able to muster the ability to maintain more than 40 boats at sea. That's not to say they have just 40 boats in their fleet, of course, but they're never able to muster many more than 40 boats at sea to conduct this kind of blockade. So we're really talking about small numbers from start to end of the First World War.
Where was their base of operations? Because Germany's a landlocked country and would have to go through the Mediterranean.
Yeah, most of the submarines based out of Kiel. It's the northwest end of Germany that abuts on the North Sea.
It has ports. Too.
Yeah, I mean Hamburg is one of the big, biggest ports in Europe. So it's got named. That's not where the submarines were based in the First World War. No. Kiel fronts directly on the North Sea. You just have to run north of Scotland or through the English Channel to get access to the Atlantic. Can be done. Yes.
I had a question about hearing that England had escorts. As ships came in, they would be escorted for safe passage once they got close to England, but there wasn't any escorts for the Lusitania.
Not where it was sunk.
What's that?
Not where it was sunk, no.
Right. Now, was that designed to attract, leaving it open for them to be attacked, to be sunk, to where now America would now want to come into the war for something like that?
Well, there's certainly, you have a very cynical one. There certainly was a major British propaganda effort to get the United States in the war as rapidly as possible. There's no question about that. I think it is on the far bounds of plausibility to presume that the British would dangle a large passenger ship as bait. But there were other considerations in play in the case of the Lusitania, because when it was sunk, it was 8 miles give or take a few, off the coast of Ireland. And Ireland, if you're a tallest student of British history, is kind of a problem issue for the British. The British were sensitive, even after American entry in the war, to major British military or naval activities in close proximity to Ireland. And although I can't say for sure that accounts for the lack of a British naval presence in the immediate vicinity of Lusitania, it may or may not have, it certainly was a consideration in how the British drew up their counter-blockade plans, right? With good reason. Lusitania was sunk in 1915, but of course in Easter of 1916, Ireland is going to be aflame. There's an open rebellion against British rule, so the British were quite right to be concerned about the Irish variable.
Okay. All these great questions point to the fact that we would like Michael Barnhart to come again.
Yeah.